All right, continuing our exploration of the fourth political theory, again, for informational and educational purposes and to get a sense of understanding. We're going to break down chapter 1, which is entitled The Birth of the Concept. I read from the introduction, which was entitled To Be or Not to Be. This is chapter 1, and I'm going to give a kind of a broad overview of the sections, and I'm going to read a little bit here and there. It's entitled The Birth of the Concept. So we're going to get into the concept of the fourth political theory, and he's going to juxtapose it against the first three political theories, which are liberalism, communism, and fascism. Quickly on the idea of the concept. So he doesn't explicitly say this, but Deleuze and Guattari, they put forth that there are three kind of main domains of thought and action in the world. You have the scientific domain. So the goal of science is to create percepts. Art, the goal of art is to create affects. And then the goal of philosophy, so you have science, art, and philosophy. The goal of philosophy is to create concepts. So we can think of the Deleuze and Guattari have this idea of the abstract machine, which is this a good actually example of an abstract machine would be neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is kind of the Ur code that determines all the social relations between human beings and institutions. It's kind of like the underlying logic of social, economic, and political systems. So in that vein, I think he is talking about the birth of the concept here, and we're going to quickly review his understanding of the first three political theories. Again, liberalism, its response, communism, and its secondary response, fascism. And then we're going to get into his initial discussion of the constellation of concepts and ideas that make up the fourth political theory. And then we're going to get into what is the subject in each political theory. So he doesn't get into the term subjectification, which is a term I think coined by Michel Foucault, which means that the historical epochs and systems of knowledge and thought develop particular subjects. So the particular person that you are during a particular historical epoch is determined by the network of social, economic, historical, and pedagogical relations that act upon the person to create the subject of that time. So he gets into what is the subject of liberalism, what is the subject in communism, and what is the subject in fascism. And again, all of this is building up to his working of the fourth political theory. Then he's going to get into some thoughts on postmodernity and the battle for postmodernity. He's going to get into this, this reemergence of tradition and theology. And then finally, I'm going to read the last couple of paragraphs about Heidegger and the event, because this is setting up the next chapter in the kind of overall general thesis of the system of the fourth political theory and the subject of the fourth political theory, which is Dasein, which is a Heideggerian concept that literally means the there. And it's kind of like an open clearing for the subject, to the new subject to emerge. So let's start at the beginning here. He says, the first section here is about the end of ideology. He says, the 20th century has ended, but it is only now that we are truly beginning to realize and to understand this fact. The 20th century was the century of ideology. If in the previous centuries, religion, dynasties, estates, classes, and nation states played an enormous role in the lives of people and societies, then in the 20th century, politics had shifted into a purely ideological realm, having redrawn the map of ethnicities, civilizations, and the world in a new way. On the one hand, political ideologies represented early and deeply rooted civilizational tendencies. On the other hand, they were completely innovative. It says all political ideologies, having reached the peak of their dominion and influence in the 20th century, were the product of the new modern era, embodying its spirit, albeit in different ways and under different symbols. Today, we are rapidly leaving this era. Thus, everyone speaks more and more frequently of the crisis of ideology, or even the end of ideology. For instance, the existence of a state ideology is explicitly denied in the Constitution of the Russian Federation. It's time to address this issue more closely. I had the three main ideologies and their fate in the 20th century. So first we have liberalism, both the left and right. Second, we have communism, including both Marxism and socialism, along with social democracy. And third, fascism, including National Socialism and other varieties of the third way. He says here, the first political theory is liberalism. It arose first as early as the 18th century and turned out to be the most stable and successful ideology, having ultimately prevailed over all its rivals. As a result of this victory, it proved, among other factors, the justification of its claim to the entire legacy of the Enlightenment. Today it is obvious that it was liberalism that was the best fit for modernity. However, this legacy was disputed earlier dramatically, actively, and at times convincingly by another political theory, communism. So it's reasonable to call communism, much like socialism in all its varieties, the second political theory. It appeared later than liberalism as a critical response to the emergence of bourgeois capitalist system, which was the ideological expression of liberalism. And finally, fascism as the third political party, as a contender for its own understanding of modernity's spirit. Many researchers, particularly Hannah Arendt, in particular, reasonably considered totalitarianism one of the political forms of modernity. Fascism, however, turned toward the ideas and symbols of traditional society. In some cases, this gave rise to eclecticism. In other cases, to the desire of conservatives to lead their own revolution instead of resisting another's and leading their society in the opposite direction, such as Arthur Moeller, Vandenbroeks, Dmitry Merzinovsky, and so on. And he goes on a bit more there. And then the next section is the end of liberalism and the arrival of postliberalism. And here's where he talks about the different subjects that these three systems create. So the subject of communism was class. Fascism's subject was the state, in Italian fascism under Mussolini, or race in Hitler's National Socialism. Moving further, he says, he talks about the liberalism and post-liberalism as the birth of globalism. He says humanity under liberalism comprised entirely of individuals. So liberalism, the subject is the individual, is naturally drawn toward universality and seeks to become global and unified. Thus, the projects of quote-unquote world government and globalism are born. Next section is entitled The Fourth Political Theory as Resistance to the Status Quo. So he's introducing the fourth political theory here as an opening in terms of a resistance to the status quo. And it reminds me of Gramsci, who was a left-wing, kind of the father of the New Left. He wrote a book called Repressive Tolerance. And he kind of said that any movements or organizing from the right must be absolutely denied and stopped, and any movements from the left must be accepted and they must prevail. Doesn't matter if they're violent or whatnot. So I think he is attacking here liberalism and neoliberalism from both the left and the right to trying to elucidate his fourth political theory. He says the fourth political theory is convinced as an alternative to post-liberalism, but not as one ideological arrangement in relation to another. Instead, it is an incorporeal idea opposed to corporeal matter, as a possibility entering into conflict with the actuality, as that which is yet to come into being, attacking that which is already in existence. And he introduces postmodernity here. He says, so the fourth political theory is a crusade, he says, against postmodernity, the post-industrial society, liberal thought realized in practice, and globalization, as well as its logistical and technological base. He says the fourth political theory is an amalgamation of a common project and arises from a common impulse to everything that was discarded, toppled, and humiliated during the course of constructing, quote, the society of the spectacle, constructing postmodernity. The stone, quote, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The philosopher Alexander Sikatsky rightly pointed out the significance of marginalia in formation of a new philosophical age, suggesting the term metaphysics of debris as a metaphor. And that's an important metaphor that he uses throughout his these next chapters talking about using the discarded symbols of liberalism, of communism, of fascism, and of postmodernity, and using them in kind of an amalgamation to attack neo-hyper-liberalism. Next section is the battle for postmodernity. He says, the fourth political theory deals with the new reincarnation of an old enemy. It challenges liberalism much like the second and third political theories of the past, but it does so under new conditions. The principal novelty of these conditions lies in the fact that of all the three great political ideologies, only liberalism secured the right to the legacy behind the spirit of modernity and obtained the right to create the quote-unquote end of history based on its own premises. Later on, he says in this section, the fourth political theory must draw its dark inspiration from postmodernity, from the liquidation of the program of the Enlightenment and the arrival of the society of the simulacra, interpreting this as an incentive for battle rather than its destiny. Next section is entitled Rethinking the Past and Those Who Lost. He says, the second and third political theories, would be communism and fascism, are unacceptable as starting points for resisting liberalism, particularly because of the way in which they understood themselves, what they appealed to, and how they operated. They positioned themselves as contenders for the expression of the soul of modernity and failed at that endeavor. Yet nothing stops us from rethinking the very fact of their failure as something positive and recasting their vices as virtues. Since the logic of the history of the new era brought us to postmodernity, then it also contained the secret essence of the new era, which is only revealed to us in the end. Later on in this section, he says, a truly significant and decisive reading of the second and third political theories is only possible on the basis of an already established fourth political theory. Postmodernity and its conditions, the globalist world governance or micromanagement, the market society, the universalism of human rights, the real domination of capital, and so on, represent the main object of the fourth political theory. However, they are radically negated as values in themselves. So we're kind of just going to broad summary here. Next section is the return of tradition and theology, where he says, tradition, religion, hierarchy, and family, and its values were overthrown at the dawn of modernity. Actually, all three political theories were conceived as artificial ideological constructions by people who comprehended in various ways the death of God, Friedrich Nietzsche, the disenchantment of the world, Max Weber, and the end of the sacred. This was the core of the new era of modernity. Man came to replace God. Philosophy and science replaced religion, and the rational, forceful, and technological constructs took the place of revelation. Later on, he says, thus the fourth political theory may easily turn toward everything that preceded modernity in order to draw its inspiration. The acknowledgement of God's death ceases to be the mandatory imperative for those who want to stay relevant. The people of postmodernity are already so resigned to this event that they can no longer understand it. Who died exactly? But in the same way, the developers of the fourth political theory can forget about this event. Quote, we believe in God, but ignore those who talk about his death, much like we ignore the words of madmen. Close quote. This marks the return of theology and becomes an essential element in the fourth political theory. When it returns, postmodernity, globalization, post-liberalism, and the post-industrial society is easily recognized as, quote, the kingdom of the Antichrist, or its counterparts in other religions, Dajjal for Muslims, Erev Rav for the Jews, and Kali Yuga for the Hindus, and so forth. This is not simply a metaphor capable of mobilizing the masses, but a religious fact, the fact of the apocalypse. And one more little section before we get to the last section on Heidegger and the event is entitled Myths and Archaism in the Fourth Political Theory. And I'm just going to read that last section. It says, not only the highest supramental symbols of faith can be taken on board once again as a new shield, but so can those irrational aspects of cults, rites, and legends that have perplexed theologians in earlier ages. If we reject the idea of progress that is inherent in modernity, which as we have seen has ended, then all this is ancient gains value and credibility for us simply by virtue of the fact that it is ancient. Quote unquote, ancient means good, and the more ancient, the better. And here's where he gets, so he says, of all creations, paradise is the most ancient one. The carriers of the fourth political theory must strive toward rediscovering it in the near future. All right, in the last section here, I'm going to read in its entirety. It's only 3-4 paragraphs, entitled Heidegger and the Event Ereignis. It sets up, really the next couple of chapters. He says, finally, we can identify the most profound ontological foundation for the fourth political theory. Here we should pay attention not only to theologies and mythologies, but also to the reflective philosophical experience of one particular thinker who had made a unique attempt of constructing a fundamental ontology, the most all-encompassing, paradoxical, profound, and penetrating study of being. I'm talking about Martin Heidegger. A brief description of Heidegger's concept is as follows. At the dawn of philosophical thought, people, or more specifically Europeans, and even more specifically the Greeks, raised the question of being, capital B, as the focal point of their thinking. But by making it their primary subject, they risked getting confused by the nuances of the complicated relationship between being, capital B, and thought, between pure being and its expression in existence, a being between the human experience of being in the world and being in itself. This failure had already occurred in the teachings of Heraclitus about the physis and the logos. Next, it is obvious that in Parmenides' work, and finally in Plato, who placed ideas between man and existence, and who defined truth as that which corresponds to them, the referential theory of knowledge reached its culmination in failure. This gave birth to alienation, eventually leading to calculating thinking, and then to the development of technology. Little by little, man lost sight of pure being and pursued the path of nihilism. The essence of technology, based on the relationship between technology and the world, expresses this ever-increasing nihilism. In the new era, this tendency reaches its pinnacle, technical development, or Gestalt, as Heidegger terms it, ultimately displaces being, capital B, and crowns nothingness. Heidegger bitterly hated liberalism, considering it an expression of, quote, the source of the calculative thinking, which lies at the heart of Western nihilism. Postmodernity, which Heidegger did not live to see in its full manifestation, is in every sense the ultimate oblivion of being. It is the midnight when nothingness, nihilism, begins to seep from all the cracks. Yet his philosophy was not hopelessly pessimistic. He believed that nothingness itself is the flip side of pure being, which, in such a paradoxical way, reminds mankind of its existence. If we correctly decipher the logic behind the unfurling of being, then thinking mankind can save itself with lightning speed at the very moment of its greatest risk. Quote, but where the danger lies, there also grows that which saves. Heidegger quotes from Frederick Holderlin's poetry. Heidegger used a special term, ereignis, the event, to describe this sudden return of being. It takes place exactly at midnight of the world's night, at the darkest moment in history. Heidegger himself constantly vacillated as to whether this point had been reached or not quite yet, the eternal not yet. Heidegger's philosophy may prove to be the central axis threading everything around itself, ranging from the reconceived second and third political theories to the return of theology and mythology. Thus, at the heart of the fourth political theory, as its magnetic center, lies the trajectory of the approaching ereignis, the approaching event, which will embody the triumphant return of being, capital B, at the exact moment when mankind forgets about it, once and for all, to the point that the last traces of it disappear. All right, so there's another section here, but I'm going to leave it there. Just wanted to give you a brief overview of Chapter 1, the birth of the concept of the fourth political theory. Chapter 2 is entitled Dasein as an actor, and we'll get into that next time. So thanks for listening, and I will see you guys next time.